The Thames has always been more than a river. It's an archive. A place where time doesn't move in a straight line, but loops back on itself, pulling fragments of the past to the surface and revealing histories long buried beneath the tide. At low tide, the river unveils its secrets. Beneath the waterline lies a record of the city's past. Some discarded, some lost, some deliberately hidden. The Thames has swallowed the remnants of the countless lives. Coins, bottles, war medals, buttons, bones. To walk along its foreshore is to sift through layers of time. Alderman Stairs has stood here for centuries, a threshold between land and water. It was once a passage for merchants, smugglers, and dock workers. Goods arrived and disappeared, some people set sail, and some never returned. The river carried wealth and power, but also loss, forced migration, and exploitation. The Thames holds uncomfortable truths. Its waters have carried the weight of empire, trade, and war. Through the centuries, it has borne witness to stories both celebrated and erased. But the river forgets nothing. Today, mudlarkers uncover what history has left behind. Each object is a clue, a whisper from the past. Some finds are personal, others challenge our understanding of history. What was lost is now found. What was buried is now seen. The Thames is a living archive, and every object tells a story. This is one of them.
I'm Anna. I live in London, and I've been mudlarking along the Thames for 10 years. I can't really remember my origin story. I do know that for a very long time I knew that there were mudlarks on the Thames, and that's quite unusual. And I've asked my dad, and I think maybe someone told my dad when I was younger that you could find pipes on the Thames, because I had the idea in my head. And the Thames is the heart of London, so I always used to go down to the river when I was young, and the river's always been part of my life. And then I lived in sub-Saharan Africa for about 10 years, and when I was there I always used to think, when I thought about London, about the Thames. And then when I came back to London and I had my kids, and then my kids were in school and they were settled, I thought, now is the time. Now I shall strike. Now is the time to go and see what mudlarking really is. So I literally started one day and then didn't stop. From the moment I went down, it became an obsession. Mudlarking is not a hobby. So sometimes people say, oh, it must be a nice hobby. Like, it's absolutely not a hobby, it's an obsession. It completely takes over your life. So as you can see, I've got all these finds behind me. And I redesigned this kitchen extension around those shelves. That was, they literally said you have to have shelves here so I can display my finds. And when I want to make a doctor's appointment, I have to say something like, I'm really sorry, I might have an appointment then. Can you hold on a minute? And I check the tide tables. Indeed, the reason you are here at 2:45 and not at 10 a.m. is because I check the tide table. So it really takes over your life, and it's a real obsession. I think what it means to me is, well, there's so many things it means. So first of all, when I started, it was transgressive. I like doing things that not a lot of other people do. So you used to go into the city in the middle of London and there were people walking up and down the streets. It was busy, they're in suits, they're hurrying to and fro offices, and you descend into this massive trench through the heart of London. And at the beginning, when I went down there 10 years ago, there weren't many people down there at all. Sometimes I was alone. And all you hear are the waves and the river going in and out and in and out, as it always has done. And then there's seagulls and other types of birds and eels, so that you're close to nature. And at the same time, I'm a journalist, and I really like stories. So every time you find an object, there's a story, and you can research it madly, so it satisfies that impulse. And also, I like lots of things, so you never know what you're going to get, so it's always a bit lucky dip, and you can't really get bored. So you don't know on any given day whether you're going to just not find very much or find the amazing thing, and that always keeps you going. It's really interesting because it connects so clearly to the rest of the world. So it's natural, it's going in and out, and in and out, and breathing in and out, going up and down, and you feel the force of it going out towards the North Sea, and then linking with other seas, and then linking with the rest of the world, which is what all the trade routes did as well. So there's this sense of connection, which is rather exciting. It feels like a kind of natural engine in the middle of the city. Sometimes I think of it as a natural engine or a natural time machine, because every time you hold an object, you're taken back in time. But it's very powerful. It's like the secret heart. I did a history A-level at school, and I found it incredibly boring. I mean, utterly dull. And what was strange about it was that I've got quite a good imagination, but I couldn't engage with anyone in the past. Everybody felt like shadows. Nothing felt real. So we'd talk about policies, and Elizabeth I did that, and people were killed in wars, and I didn't feel or experience them as a real people having terrible things happen to them. And mudlarking connects you to the ordinary objects from ordinary people, and when you research those objects, you get an insight into their world. Sometimes you get a real insight into their world. You might find an object and it's got a name on it, and you can actually find out what happened to someone 400 years ago. And in that way, it changes your view of history because it becomes peopled. So London suddenly becomes layered. You can not only imagine what it looked like through these artefacts and imagine what it felt like through the texture of these artefacts, but you could actually imagine the people who walk the streets, the people who aren't normally covered in history books. So there's a little token I've got, it's called a trader's token from the 17th century, and it's got a man's name on it called John Fielder. And I just researched it because his name was there, and I knew roughly when he was born, 1640. I knew he was around sometime between 1649 1670 when this coin would have been issued. And I researched him. He was a Quaker. I found out that he'd fought in the Civil War in England. I found out that he'd been injured in the head in the battle at Farnham Castle. I found a record of when his inn, the hand-in-hand inn in Kingston upon Thames, had been raided by a militia, and what they said to him, I think it was, "I'm going to break your rogue bones." And I found all that, so I revivified him. It's very powerful. That's what it's like. You take people out of the obscurity of all the masses who have died, and you revivify them, and you hold them up to the light, and you kind of honour them, and then you put them back. Every single object has changed the way I think about the past. Even if it's an ordinary object, you might think, I didn't know they had that then. Everything has coloured it in. So in that way, it's changed my view of the past. And I think a lot of it has also made me understand the past better. Not so much changed it as made me understand abstract concepts in a very concrete way when I've researched the history. To give you an example, you get a lot of clay pipes. I think you can see some of them behind me there, I think. I don't know whether you can see them there. They look like cigarettes. They don't. They look like pipes, but they're white, and they're made of clay, and they are basically old-fashioned cigarettes. And they came to England in about the late 16th century. They came to the court, and they begin with little tiny bowls for the tobacco. And then throughout the next 200 years, the bowls get bigger and bigger. And people like them because you can date them really easily. You can say, oh, yes, that's about a 1640 pipe, and it makes you feel like a proper archaeologist. But they're actually incredibly easy to date. But what's interesting about them is the reason the bowls get bigger is because tobacco got cheaper. And the reason tobacco got cheaper was because at some point in the 17th century, some cynical merchants thought, right, there's a demand for these pipes. Let's get some indentured labourers from England and send them over to the Caribbean, and they can work some farms over there, and then we can make more tobacco. And that didn't work, so they decided just to take advantage of all the slaves that they could steal from Africa and bring over to the Caribbean and work these big plantations. So the size of the pipe is telling you a story about the exploitation of people in Africa, the history of slavery. And then it makes you realise, well, it's always been the same. You know, we're having these cheap throwaway cigarettes, these clay pipes. People could throw them away. I've got about 1,000 of them. You can just chuck them. And it's no different from fast fashion today, say, where the supply line relies on someone being exploited further down the line. So it makes you understand that it was ever thus, that people are very similar today than they were before. Things aren't really that different. They just appear in different forms. I view the Thames as mighty. I view the Thames as predating London and predating people are sort of constant. We kind of fluctuate around it. And I also think of the Thames as a repository for everything that's ever happened in London as leaving a trace in London. So it feels like a living thing to me, like a powerful force. But at the same time, I think of it as a trench, like an archaeological trench that goes through the middle of London. And I think that anything that's ever happened of any import in London since the Romans established it 2,000 years ago, I always like to believe that some trace of that has been left in the Thames, because so much of London life has gone around the Thames. So in a way, I suppose you could think of it as an archive, though I suppose I think of archive as slightly more ordered than what it is that you find in the river. More a repository rather than an archive. But actually there's a correlation between what you find in the river and what happened on the foreshore or what happened above the foreshore, so it's not completely random. So in that sense, there's a sort of like sorted archive. There's another kind of archive actually which I like about the Thames, which is that when you have an archive, you organise it, you decide how you're going to sort it. So we tend to sort things by meaning, but the river has its own way of sorting objects. So it sorts by size and shape. So once you have objects deposited on the Thames, in this archive, then the waves come in and out and the force of the tides come in and out, and it shuffles things around. So it'll put objects that little round objects all be together. So you might get a little bone counter from Roman times next to a little Smarties plastic lid if they weigh the same thing. So it's not sorting by intention, it's sorting by weight. So it's got its own little archive going on there, its own little sorting system. There is a brooch that I thought I'd lost recently, and I was really sad that I thought I lost it, so I know I'm attached to it. And I love it because it's Georgian, which is 18th century. And I was on the foreshore. There wasn't anyone there. It was an early Sunday morning and there were church bells. And the wave came in and it pushed up this beautiful brooch with a copper edge and a mother of pearl centre. And as the wave pulled out, the two parts separated. So if it had pulled in again, it would probably have smashed or completely been lost. I'd have just had the rim or just had the little bit of mother of pearl, and that wouldn't have lasted. So I rescued it. So I like the fact that I rescued it. But also I like it because I think it shouldn't have survived. So I like it because it shouldn't have survived. I imagine it was dislodged from the mud just beyond the edge of the waves and then washed in. I also like it because I imagine something like that, which is not something that would be intentionally thrown away. So it's not rubbish. A lot of the stuff that's in the Thames is just old rubbish. It might be 15th century or 16th century rubbish, but it's still trash. This wasn't trash. Somebody either lost it or they threw it away. And one of the reasons they might have thrown it away is that those mother of pearl bases were sometimes used as a basis to draw portraits on in the 18th century. Might draw a portrait of your lover even. So perhaps it's something that someone threw away when they were broken-hearted. Or maybe they were walking along and it fell off and they were really annoyed. Little did they know I'd find it 250 years later. So I like that object. And another object that I like is a beautiful little, it's called a bottle seal. It's a blob of glass, it's iridescent. So it shimmers in the light. And I didn't even know what it was when I picked it up. I was mudlarking at night, so I couldn't really see. And I just liked the way it felt, so I kept it. I didn't see it had writing on it. When I turned it over, I saw there was a man's name, R. Sully, a date, 1728, and an address, 9 Elms, which is near Battersea. So I've got all this information about someone on this beautiful piece of iridescent glass. And I'm going to trace him. That's one of my goals, is to trace that person. I found a vicar that seems to have lived there about that time, but I don't know. So most of the things that I'm finding, particularly metal objects, have been encased in mud. They've been encased in anaerobic mud. The Thames mud doesn't have oxygen in it, which means that it doesn't decay. So a lot of things come out just as they went in, including things that would disintegrate on land, like wood and leather. So you're not going to find those things on a field if you're metal detecting. But in the Thames, you can pull out a piece of leather and it's like it was when it went in. The things that decay a lot are anything made of iron, like tools. So I've got heavily rusted objects and heavily corroded coins that have come out of the mud and then just knocked around in the water a lot. Some people really love bringing them back to life. They're really good with their hands. They find a fantastic challenge. You can imagine them going like that and working away at it. To me, it just felt exhausted. I don't like cleaning. The whole thing just... The first time I tried to do it with a silver button, a beautiful solid silver button, I tried to do electrolysis and I just wiped the pattern off the front of it. So I don't really trust myself too well. So most things other than iron come out in a pretty good state, I would say. There is one exception, which is there's a kind of pottery which has a tin glaze on it, and that pottery often comes out black. But once you recognise a pottery, you know that there's going to be a design underneath. And if you drop it in a little bowl of water with denture cleaner in it for like 10 minutes, for some reason that removes the blackness and this pattern emerges. It's like magic. Yeah, and you feel like an expert. Yes, I know how to. Mudlarks have made a real contribution to the understanding of London's history, and they still are. So I asked a friend for a specific example, and apparently the medieval pewter children's toys that were found on the Thames several decades ago, for example, have had a big impact on the way people understand childhood in medieval times. A friend of mine found a piece of Roman pottery and realised it had come from somewhere in the Middle East. But that meant he then researched it and discovered that there was no record of that maker having ever gone as far as England before. So by discovering it in London, he's showing that there were trade routes that went all the way to London just by discovering this bit of pottery. So the better the researcher, I mean, he's a very good researcher, the better the information you can recover, but definitely. And also modern objects tell modern stories. I don't pick them all up, but I like sex toys, you know, they wash up, I mean, they tell you something. You get massive pink vibrators being tossed off the Millennium Bridge by a hen party. But that's a story. Imagine finding that in 70 years. I'd be beside myself with excitement, because that tells you about the hen party culture of early 21st century Britain, which is quite interesting, actually, I think. And even Tampax applicators. I mean, they're plastic, which is distressing. But at the same time, if you were to look at it as I look at every other object, you'd think this is what women used in the early 21st century to manage their menstrual cycle, and how did they manage that and go to work, and what does it mean about women in the workplace? So literally everything tells a story. So I spoke earlier about clay pipes, which connect to slavery. Yeah. We also find little tiny glass beads, and those beads were used as currency for us to trade with countries that didn't have a monetary currency. They used beads instead as sort of status symbols. So we used to give them beads, maybe guns, and they'd give us back their furs and their ivory. So you do find those, just sort of intriguing. I just felt intrigued. That's what I feel mainly. How interesting. There's this material evidence of this economy, which is based on exploitation, and also really interesting. And the more you get into beads, the more interesting it gets. You know, you've discovered Venice and the island where they used to make the beads. Great woman bead maker of the 16th century that I hadn't heard about before. So it's more of the same, really, prompting stories in different directions. But yes, there's a lot of stories of exploitation on the Thames. So myself and a lot of other mudlarks tend to exhibit our finds. So the Thames Festival has, for the last few years, has had exhibitions at St Paul's Cathedral and the Maritime Museum, and we all show our finds and we talk about them to the public. And I'm sure through that we're not just telling people about the object or about London, we are raising those issues that connect specifically to us or interest us. And in that way, we are reminding people of London's history and its role. So through clay pipes or trade beads, we might be reminding people about slavery, but also in other cases just reminding them or telling them how their ancestors might have lived 200 years ago. It's a kind of mix of all different ways of bringing the past to life. But unfortunately, I think that I miss objects. I think that I'm too literal when I'm looking for objects. So I could recognise a boat hook that was uncrusted from the shape, or a really good 19th century padlock. And I have cleaned away all the rust in this lovely padlock has emerged that's 150 years old and thought, wow, that's fantastic. But in general, I think I miss stuff. So I have friends and they come back with, to me, things that look blank or blobby. And then they reveal them. And I'm not that person. And I often think I ought to be. I just ought to. And I have actually got a box of like little bits of metal, which is slightly trashed. And I often think, okay, I'm going to sit down for a day and I'm going to discover it. I did actually try that in COVID. I got my little box of metal trash and I thought I'm just going to sift through it and have a little clean here. And something I thought was an old metal loop turned out to be a ring, for example. I found 2 rings in the box. So you do get discoveries when you clean up. But I sometimes wish that I was more focused on that, on reviving these objects, but also I had a better eye for spotting the things that aren't what they look like. So the other thing you do get are the natural objects that masquerade as man-made objects. They're very annoying. So you get something called a wig curler, and it's made out of pipe clay, and they're 17th and 18th century, and they're really great. It's hard to get a hold, and I've got 2 hold ones now. And they always look like some sort of bone to me. I always think they look a bit like a large chicken bone. And I know, I often look at them and think, I would have walked past you. If I hadn't seen a picture of that before, I'd have walked past you because you're masquerading as a chicken bone. And there's quite a lot of objects that look like they could be natural, but they're not. Yeah. And there's other objects that so there's something called a Jew's harp, which is a musical instrument you put in your mouth and you twang it. It makes a terrible noise like a didgeridoo, but it's mini. And I remember picking them up and discarding them, thinking, oh, it's just a bit of old metal. And it was only when I saw a picture that someone else had found and they cleaned it up, and I thought, oh my goodness me, I've been throwing away 17th century Jew's harps and just chucking them back in the river. So I hadn't had the wit to notice that I could have transformed it. And actually now, sadly, I had a really nice encrusted key, and I sent it to this older mudlark called Graham, who's in his 80s, who loves to transform. And he transformed it for me and it came back nice and shiny. So when you pick up an item, you think about who walked on it, who held it, what they were doing. So you feel like you're putting out your hand and you're holding their hand across the centuries. More so when it's a named object, but even a common everyday object. You experience the world like they did. So people used to keep their clothes together with very sharp pins. And everyone had pins. They were ubiquitous, particularly for women. Women were pinned into their clothing for shape. And I think about them and how when they moved it must have pricked them, because I hate being confined, so it must have been really annoying. So I feel like I experienced their world a little bit. So the Thames has been used as a dumping ground, not just for rubbish, but for sewage for a very long time. In the 19th century there was something called the Great Stink, where it became overwhelmingly polluted and disgusting, like foul. And so you still get sewage in the river, even though there was a Victorian proper system was built, it's still disgusting. And sometimes when there is a storm, the water companies are allowed to do a sort of sewage let out, and they'll lift up the storm cover and the sewage will go into the Thames or the sea. And you know when that has happened because there's a place, for example, that I think of as Sanitary Towel Corner. Once I counted 52 little sanitary towels there. It's very unusual because actually, in general, the Thames foreshore is remarkably free of that sort of rubbish. But in that point, there must be something to do with the way the current goes. Sanitary Towel Corner, and another place where you get a lot of Tampax applicators. So now they're building a super sewer to try and deal with London's sewage. And in constructing that sewer, they seem to have moved slightly. It seems to have had an effect on some of the currents. So one place that used to be like delightfully, it used to give me so much, it was so clear, has been covered in sludge and leaves and trash for the last 2 or 3 years. And I asked a friend who's more knowledgeable than me, and he pointed out where they were building the sewer and said, I think that's what it is. They've altered the course of the river by having this object protruding into the water. So things like that have changed. And then the other change is that the clippers, the clippers, the Uber boats they're called now, those boats go up and down and they have a huge wash. They're problematic in other countries. I think in Australia they were really eroding the foreshore. They were causing problems. And in London they're just stripping away the mud. So in one way it's beneficial for mudlarks because it means that The mud might be like a chocolate mousse instead if it wasn't being washed away, and you couldn't get at you couldn't get at the rocks beneath them and the harder surface. But it takes away so much and so fast that I suppose at some point it's going to get down to like the base level of the river before humans started coming along and chucking their rubbish in. And you can see that change in parts. You think, oh, there's a spot that I sometimes go to and I think, oh, hello, little shells, little clam shells. Because those aren't the oyster shells that people let in Victorian London or Roman Britain and threw into the water. You think these are the shells of animals that lived here in this spot years ago. It's a particular kind of green mud. During COVID, when I used to go down, I didn't go down, I used to go and look mournfully at the foreshore, because in the first lockdown we weren't allowed on the foreshore. And I'd look mournfully down, but it literally was covered in a kind of chocolatey mousse thing. You couldn't have found anything, just like gloop. The only way to have found would be to dig. And that's why in the 70s, mudlarks tended to dig and not be surface finders, because they had to get down to find stuff. But so we in one way, Ubers are our friends, the Uber boats, but in another, they're destroying the foreshore and washing it away. And you can see an object that was buried suddenly is sitting on the surface, or you can see a plank of wood or a drain that was embedded in the foreshore and has been for 400 years suddenly wash away. So it's quite dramatic changes. So mudlarks in general don't like to give away their location, mainly because you might have discovered that location for yourself, particularly if you've been mudlarking for a few years when there wasn't social media information, like it wasn't shared, and it was a bit like you'd go down there and you had to discover it for yourself, and that was part of the challenge. These days it's changed a bit. People know where areas are. So you're not really normally going to get mudlarks saying, oh yeah, I go there, because you think, it's taken me a long time to find that spot. But in general, I am in central London, somewhere between Battersea and up to the Thames Barrier and Woolwich, somewhere in that long span, depending on my mood, depending on whether the time of day. Sometimes the tide will be very low about an hour earlier, say in the east, than it will be in Battersea. So if I'm in a hurry, I might, if I have to go somewhere later, I might just go east for that reason. Or sometimes I think I just fancy finding some Victorian dockyard stuff, so I know where I'll go for that. But I tend to roam up and down. So the people who've started more recently, even in the last 5 years, not that more recently, because they started and there were higher numbers, they're very happy to mudlark in a group or together. They have a different sort of culture. But if I go out with two of my friends mudlarking, they'll be like that down the other end of the foreshore. I won't be able to see them. So that's our idea of mudlarking together. And then at the end we'll come together and see what we've got, because we'll just be stomping up and down in our different areas. Yeah. And the other thing you should never do to a mudlark is when it's low tide and they're really searching, you don't go up and say, oh yeah, what have you found? You're thinking, no, go away. You don't want to be rude, but no, it's like the low tide. Well, there'll be a very brief 20 minutes where you're going to get the lowest point of the tide, and at that point people tend to be focused. I've had people say that to me when I start. Just someone look at me like I was completely crazy and say, not now, it's low tide. And you think, oh, sorry. So I have a relationship with the river. So it's not like I go down there and then exploit it. I'm aware of it and I have a relationship with it. I have friends who've spoken about it in a much more collaborative sense, in that they feel that they do something for the river and the river gives something back to them. Particularly if it's about giving something back to the river, like taking away plastic or throwing in a coin, are two examples two of my friends gave me quite recently. And they've always then spoke about being rewarded by the river afterwards. So people do have that sort of relationship. But mine is more just an awareness of it as a thing. So it's not like a patch of river that I've got a relationship with, it's the whole thing. I feel like it's a mighty thing that I'm aware of, and I've been swimming in it in various points. So I feel like a little bit of an intimate knowledge upstream. So I've gone kayaking on it.
Oh wow!
I feel like I've seen it at its widest point. I feel like I know it quite well, which is quite a nice thing to do. You know that I quite like that.